Thank you all for coming and fighting the cold. My name is Dan Fagin. I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program here at the Carter Institute of Journalism. And it's a pleasure to have you all here for our first Inside Out event of the semester. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Nate Johnson, a person who I've actually never met before, but I've read his stuff with admiration for a long time. He does something that is really the hardest thing to do in journalism, and that is to go against the expectations of your readers. But he did that, and he did it really well. Anyway, Lee will talk more about that, but I just wanted to welcome Nate and say thank you very much for coming all the way from California. We really appreciate it. And with that, I will turn it over to Lee Hotz, a distinguished journalist in residence, writer in residence here at the Carter Institute, and science writer for the Wall Street Journal, and our host for these events. It's all yours, Lee.
Thank you, Professor Fagin. So welcome to Inside Out. And for those of you who have not joined us before, this is our forum for investigating the best of our science writing craft by putting those who practice it successfully at the highest level under the lens of our collective attention. And our tool of inquiry is a conversation, and that's a conversation that I encourage you, invite you, beg you to join as we get rolling. Interrupt us, help us digress, help us go up the blind alleys of interesting and creative digressions. When you do so, make sure you get the microphone from Dan, because we are taping this and we're going to share it with the rest of the science writing community, and they'll want to hear your questions. So I will appreciate your doing that. So this spring, and I say spring in a kind of aspirational sense right now, because of course it's like, what, 10 degrees outside? In fact, it is a measure, I suppose, of how our guest this evening is sketching his profile in courage, just by noting that he flew out to join us this afternoon from San Francisco, where I can tell you it is 50 degrees warmer. In any event, it is our intent this spring semester to present you all with a series of reporters and editors who in one way or another have made their professional mark by steering an informed course through highly polarized coverage. On March 9th, we'll visit with Laura Helmuth, who is the Science and Health editor at Slate, where she does her best to stir the conversation about online science and medical controversies. On March 30th, we'll be joined by award-winning conservation writer Michelle Nihus, whose coverage has highlighted how scientists now are having to decide in a really classical triage sense which species, which endangered species will live and which endangered species will die. And on April 30th, we'll be talking with science and technology writer Brooke Borel, who is turning our collective obsession for you New Yorkers with bed bugs into an interesting book, which we're going to be talking about. But tonight we're going to put Nathanael Nate Johnson under our lens. Now, for those of you who don't know, Nate is based in San Francisco, and he's a freelancer for a long time, contributed to magazines such as Harper's, New York Magazine, and Conservation, to National Public Radio, where he's worked for many years as a radio producer before becoming a full-time food writer for the Grist. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, Wired. He's appeared on This American Life, and he's also performed as part of the live pop-up magazine events in San Francisco. And in front of this, we have a copy of his first book, which is All Natural: A Skeptic's Quest to Discover if the natural approach to diet, childbirth, healing, and the environment really keeps us healthier and happier.
Also a quest for the world's longest subtitle.
I don't know that it's a quest for the world's longest subtitle. I think we have a finalist. But it does I think, encapsulate in its all-encompassing long-windedness the approach that you're taking to coverage. Such kind of questions as, why as medicine improves, we're becoming less healthy? Why are more American women dying in childbirth, even as hospital births become like the norm? Why do we grow fatter the more we diet? Why have so many attempts to save the environment backfired? This kind of his coverage, the Huffington Post says, we need more writers like Nathanael Johnson, exploring the gray areas beyond what we think we know, what we think we believe in, and what we want to be true. Mother Jones says, well, think of him as Alex P. Keaton, but without the suits and the Reagan fetish. Now, one of the things that we're going to delve into here, besides his book, is also a series of stories that he did for Grist, 26-part series, The Miracles of the Ever Open-Ended Nature of the Internet. A series on genetically modified food. This was a series entitled Panic-Free GMOs. And topics range from the existence of allergies in genetically engineered foods to reviews of books on GMOs and to the connection between genetically engineered seeds and herbicide addiction. And this was a series, I say, it was kind of written on the fly, which is not how we always do things. And it attracted a considerable and highly polarized reactions. Anti-GMO campaigners said, he's either a naive fool or just another Monsanto tool. Pro-GMO blogger Michael Eisen, a prominent biologist, says he's letting opponents of GMOs off the hook. He's giving them permission to continue demanding that voters and politicians reject reason and evidence and ban a technology based on ill-founded fears and hard evidence. He was tagged as an advocate. How would we say it? Agrovocate?
I think just advocate. If you try and get the grow there.
Agvocat.
Yes.
Agvocat. Agvocat.
I don't know where this is going, but let's just keep
Yeah.
going.
Well, we're playing with the kind of sound qualities here because we're going to talk about your radio work. But I thought Discover actually encapsulated it very nicely when they looked and they said, the overwhelming consensus judgment of science journalists is that Johnson has done a spectacular job of sifting through all the claims and counterclaims and the technical density of a complex field of science to render clear-headed assessments. And he's done this while buffeted by the great sound and fury of the quarrelsome GMO debate. It really is an impressive feat. So we're going to delve into some of this evening, and I think I'd like to start, at any rate, with how you started. You are a small-town hippie boy.
That's right.
From the wilds of Nevada City. Tell us about this.
Yeah, Nevada City, California. We had the name first. I just want to make that clear. So yeah, I was born at home in Berkeley, and then my parents decided that Berkeley was too citified and conservative, and we moved to Nevada City. And that's where I grew up and sort of had my worldview set.
Yeah, no, I feel to say for those who don't have an intimate knowledge of the nooks and crannies of the California socio-political ecosystem, that Nevada City is not just a normal small town.
Right. So it's a place that was an old gold mining town that Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder bought some property up there in the 60s, and then that attracted this whole wave of kind of free thinkers and artists and bohemians, and so it's become this wonderful place with all kinds of crazy ideas and wonderful ideas about health and science and the arts.
And so this shapes you in what way? You grow up without diapers?
Yeah.
You grow up
So-
inculcated in this sort of Mr. Naturalness of
Yeah, and loving nature and the outdoors and just kind of having this overwhelming sympathy and tender feeling for this idea that what's natural is healthy and good, and kind of feeling on the side of those who believe those things and have all the sets of beliefs that go along with it.
And so you went to college, you went, what?
I went to Pomona College in
Pomona
Southern
College?
California.
Mhm.
And
Burning with, no doubt, with an ambition to be a journalist, right?
well, I didn't really figure that out until I was forced
no.
to.
It's all right. You can say no. No. You can say
Yeah.
no. I had no interest whatsoever in journalism.
I guess that's accurate.
Did
actually.
you read papers? I mean,
I did. I started reading
when they
papers.
came wrapped in things, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, and only because I sort of, like midway through my college career, I was like really floundering, and I thought, maybe journalism might be something, and so I subscribed to the New York Times and started. And I remember the science section was like, oh, this is actually a little bit more interesting to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had kind of a profound lack of interest in the daily news all the way up through college.
Right. And in college, if I understand correctly, you dabbled as physics major,
Well-
things like that. But you were, you liked the science, but you were, how shall I say, not very good at lab work.
Exactly.
I think that's a kind of an operational definition of many science journalists. Love science, but really not very good at lab work. So how did you get, what was the tripwire for you?
To fall into journalism?
Well, or fall into something, I don't know. You got here somehow, so.
Well, I graduated in 2001, and I thought, maybe I would. Journalism kind of sounded interesting, but so did a whole bunch of other things. And I spent the summer. I went up to Alaska and I worked as a whitewater raft guide for the summer, and came back home. And I was like, all right, I'm moved in with my parents, And
That was your career move.
Yeah, that was my, and I was, that started to get old very quickly, and then 9/11 happened, and
Okay.
and that made me feel many things, but one of them was this fear that there was going to be this tremendous narrowing of economic opportunities, and I would be stuck with my parents forever, and so I'd been thinking about journalism, and that just kind of happened to be the thing that I hit on, and I started applying to every tiny little newspaper and radio station that was offering a job. And nobody was interested, really.
Yeah.
Except for one place in southern Idaho. And they took a chance on me.
In the Magic Valley, yeah?
In the Magic Valley of southern Idaho, yeah. Which is just sort of the tea that Utah and Nevada make with the bottom of Idaho. If you just go about 20 miles north of there is Twin Falls, Idaho, which is where the newspaper was based. And then I was eventually put into the Burley Bureau of the Twin Falls Times-News.
The Burley Bureau of the Twin Fall News.
Yeah.
That has got such a Garrison Keillor quality to it. What were you doing in the Burley Bureau?
I had an important position that involved covering trees that made people uncomfortable, and 4-H shows, and the county commissioners, and the planning and zoning board, and so it's, just the very brass tacks, going to public meetings, writing stories, general assignment reporting in a small town.
And
Did the police
yeah,
police blotter?
Police blotter. I mean, did you start to sort of use this as a springboard into classic sort of Nevada City environment writing, or did you?
Well, I was certainly interested in that, and there's a whole. It's kind of an unremittingly ugly landscape. It's completely flat, and you've got these gigantic, 10,000-acre farms, one after another, and where there's not farms, there's sagebrush and there's manure blowing on the wind, and but there's also these large national forests right out, if you drive far enough on the dirt roads, and so I got very excited whenever there was a chance to write about something like, they're releasing bighorn sheep back into the wild, or they're thinking about putting wind turbines on the hills, and there was also this. I started to see that there was this kind of conflict with environmental issues in agriculture, and I was covering agriculture a lot because I was going to these planning and zoning boards, and people were trying to build these big dairies at that time. And
They were being driven out of California.
they were being driven out of California because California likes laws and Idaho doesn't. And so it seems like a good place to set up a 9,999 head dairy operation. And it was a really interesting situation because you had these people who were pretty conservative on both sides, but there was still this conflict. So I remember going out to interview this old Jack Mormon cowboy who had just resigned from the Planning and Zoning Board, and I was asking him why he'd resigned, and he said, well, I thought that this would be a great position for me to defend property rights as a libertarian. But then whose property rights do you defend? Do you defend the homeowner's property rights, or do you defend the property rights of the person that wants to build this massive CAFO? And so it was wonderful to see that, these political positions have to grapple with things that they hadn't expected. And so all of this kind of got under my skin. I mean, in some ways it was a really tough experience. I was terrible at what I was doing initially. My editor was cruel and unreasonable about me messing up AP style and forced me to learn very quickly. But this feeling that I could talk to people on different sides and go back and forth and accumulate evidence and figure out who was bullshitting me and who was telling me the truth was this amazing and wonderful feeling. And I really fell in love with journalism, with sort of those core precepts.
Well, that's kind of wonderful, but I'm also curious, this is an agricultural community.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things I find quite striking about your work is that you are, of course, writing about food and such, but you're actually writing about it through the lens of people who actually produce it.
Right.
Which, in American journalism in the 21st century, is actually fairly odd. I mean, it's one of the great blind spots.
Yes, absolutely.
California papers, actually, I think agricultural exports are like the #1 state product in a state that has the 7th largest economy in the world, and there is nobody who actually has the assignment of covering on a regular basis agribiz, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, there are specific verticals.
Well, yeah, but we peel them out, and that's something we can talk about. I mean, yeah, people write about food endlessly. People write about nutrition. People may peel off a particular science controversy, in this case, genetically modified foods, but it's the sustained institutional focus is kind of lacking. So I'm in part curious, and perhaps we're curious about how that got under your skin. I appreciate that journalism got under your skin, and we honor you for that. But why agribiz? Why food? Why boar breeding? Why?
Well, I think that for one thing, it was just the currency that I was dealing with, but. The other part of it is that, I got to know these people who were very different than me, and I made good friends with these people who had very different political ideas than I did. And part of this journey of falling in love with journalism, had to do with realizing that some of my earnestly held beliefs may not be as valid as I thought they were. And so I gained a lot of respect for these, hardworking Mormon farmers that I was talking to, and I saw. I guess I think it probably wasn't until later, years later, that I looked back and saw exactly what you're describing, where you have a lot of journalists, certainly not all, but covering agriculture as if it's this strange foreign power and not actually talking to not actually talking to the farmers, and not even talking to the researchers and the professors, except maybe as like the last oppositional interview when they've got their entire story written, and then this is the, give me a quote so that it shows that I've talked to both sides type of thing. And it's a very strange way of doing journalism. The analogy I draw is to medicine. I think both the food system and the medical system in this country have in some ways, are crazy. There's major things wrong with them. But if we covered medicine the same way that we covered food, you'd see a lot of journalists not talking to people at mainstream medical colleges, except in that last oppositional essay, and getting most of their facts and their resources from activist groups or from doctors of chiropractic or acupuncturists. And I think that's kind of where we are right now with a lot of the food coverage that we have in the US. I took that kind of, I don't know if I actually answered the...
No, this is the home of circular digressions, so don't feel constrained to be linear. So, you were in Burley for what, 2 years?
Yeah.
2 years, and then what, looked yourself in the mirror and you said, if I stay one more day here, I'm going to kill myself, so I better go to graduate school.
Right.
What?
I have enormous affection for Burley, I just want to say. But,
yeah, no, I'm the one who's
But it was, but yeah, no, it was, I mean, it was a tough place to be as a young man who was not married. It felt like everybody was married by the time they graduated from high school there. So, and yeah, so my escape was graduate school, and I applied to several places and was specifically interested in Berkeley because I saw that Michael Pollan was going to be teaching there. He just started, and I'd been reading his stuff and feeling like, I was doing these, kind of scratching at the surface, looking at the rise of the CAFO in southern Idaho through planning and zoning meetings, and he was doing this 10,000-foot view and writing eloquently about the same sort of things. And so I wanted to learn how to do that.
You have a chip on your shoulder, a little bit. Small town guy arriving at big. How did that work?
Well, I think the chip on my shoulder was mostly about the fact that I had done 2 years slogging it out, and I had learned AP style, and I knew how to get someone on the phone, and I knew how to get the interview when someone didn't want to give the interview. And a lot of my classmates hadn't done that, and they wanted to be documentarians, or they'd come straight from undergrad. And so there were certain elements of kind of old school journalistic practice that I thought were very important.
So you were like the returning war veteran, I've seen it, kid.
Yeah, I'm on the GI Bill.
But you were clearly very influenced by your experience as a student with Michael Pollan. How did that work?
Well, Michael is just an amazing teacher and just a very generous person with his time. And so it was just interesting to see the level of background that he was willing to put into his own work and that he expected from us. Just seeing that he would read books in order to write a piece, whereas I would maybe think, oh, you could like interview someone who's written a book on this quickly. The idea that you'd dedicate a couple days to go hang out in a library and pull everything out and then actually read all those books and get that background was kind of mind-blowing to me.
So you graduated, and there you are on the street again.
Yeah.
And what do you do?
Well, I had an internship at New York Magazine for a summer and was basically, transcribing.
How did you get the internship?
It was through the journalism school I'd applied for.
Okay.
But I had done a piece freelance during school for a radio station in San Francisco, a smaller public radio station in San Francisco. And while I was out in New York, they offered me a part-time gig. And that sounded like certainly better than nothing, but like a great deal. I could do that, and I could freelance and do magazine work, which I was interested in doing as well. And that would sort of cover the baseline expenses. And
So you're a radio reporter, really?
yeah,
5 years?
yep, 5 years.
What kinds of things do you do?
You name it. Arts, transportation, editing, sound mixing. I covered the cops for a while.
So again, very classic general assignment stuff. I mean, I don't hear a budding specialist in here anywhere.
No, not at all. But at the same time, I was doing all of these magazine pieces, and they all, I didn't really think about it, but they all kind of tended toward this interest that I developed originally in Nevada City, and like the Nevada City ethos is that we're plagued by the evils of modern technology, and it's making us sick and unhealthy. And when I gained this idea that you could go out and you could actually fact check and find evidence, I started becoming more and more interested in applying that to my the ethos of my childhood. So that, like, I did a piece about artificial insemination and kind of the hog industry. And
I have to say, one of the most startling things I've read in a long time.
yeah, it sort of has a funny opener, and that came from Burley, so that was sort of in the hopper, and came out a little after I graduated from journalism school, and so there was one story after another that was kind of developing this specialty.
So the hog piece, if I may call it that, the
Yeah.
hog artificial insemination piece, the boar teasing
Right.
piece, that ran in what?
In Harper's.
It ran in Harper's, yeah, a very sort of high-end magazine with a kind of literary patina. How do you pitch hog artificial insemination to Harper's? What was your approach? Did you know an editor there? Were you just hurling this over the transom?
This is why you go to journalism school. I mean, Michael suggested that I pitch it to, Michael Pollan suggested I pitch it to, was that just an earthquake? I guess we don't.
Yeah,
we don't
right.
have those.
You're showing your right. No, that was a heavy truck driving downtown, full of illicit garbage of some sort or other.
So, pitching the hog story, I'd worked on that in journalism school with Michael Pollan, and he suggested that I pitch it to Harper's, and he had spent many years there, and he was at that time Roger Hodge was the editor that I pitched to.
Because it's not a conventional story topic. I mean,
who isn't interested in sex with animals? I will say.
I'm just going to let that.
I will say that I put a lot of time into that pitch.
What did you do?
Well, if you go back and look at the story, it's the first section of the story is basically the pitch.
Well, sure it was, because
and so
I've read it, they haven't. So.
Yeah. So it's basically recounting an experience I had in Burley, where one of my only friends and I were having a drink at one of the only bars, and she was a veterinarian in a big hog operation, and she was saying, oh my gosh, I had such a hard day today. I got trampled like 4 times by the sows, and sometimes they're mellow, but sometimes when you stimulate them, they really start to act up. And I sort of set down my beer and I said, what do you mean by stimulate? And then she told me this whole process by which our bacon is conceived. And it's really sort of Baroque and bizarre. And I don't know if this reveals something about me, but I was like, oh my gosh, tell me more. You know? And so I spent, I kept on, I kept this in the back of my head and kept on doing work to figure out, like, why do we have this? Why do we go through this? What are the structural reasons that are in place that make this make sense? And so with that pitch, I really worked hard to make it funny and a little bit, a little bit obscene, just enough to tease, but also to be very elevated and to give a sense that there was something bigger here that was going to be explored.
And did you get a quick response from Harper's? Did you get that? Wow, we've been looking for the right Bohr story for a while, and clearly, son, this is it.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was fairly. We'll take a look at the piece when it's done. If you want to do it on spec.
On spec, okay.
And which was no problem because I'd been working on it in J school anyway. So I sent it over as soon as it was ready, and yeah, it was basically, we'll tweak a couple things here and there, but this looks good. I mean, that's unusual, and I think only because I'd been working on it with the editor from Harper's, a former, with Michael Pollan for a while, rather than, so there was that confidence in the fact that he'd polished it in the way that they expected.
That's a good place to start.
Yeah. That chip on my shoulder only grew from, oh yes, I graduated from grad school and I start out with a big magazine piece in Harper's. And I think that became a little bit of a liability for me, the fact that I was like, I'm this awesome magazine writer now, and I will only write for the finest of people.
So did you then start messing up a lot? I mean,
I did. I think it made me a little cocky, and there were a couple stories that got killed that I probably could have worked harder and made them work, and there were, I think, a lot of stories that I just should have hustled and made happen. Instead, I sort of was like, well, maybe there's nothing there, and so yeah, I think the good lesson from that is that you never make it. You got to keep. It's very apparent when you stop hustling, I think, in this field.
I actually think that's a real syndrome, that sometimes with help from J school profs, or sometimes just through a wonderful idea and good timing, or for whatever reason, sometimes people really hit it initially, and it often is actually more trouble than it's worth sometimes, in the long run, because people feel like, well, therefore everything else I do has to be at a place as great as the place that I just wrote for. And that's so not the way to think about this.
Yeah.
The way to think about this is to stay working all the time and to find the best home you can for your work, but that's not always going to be as good as the place where your last piece ran. So it's interesting that you had to learn that lesson, but I think a lot of people learn that lesson.
Yeah, and every piece isn't going to be as good as the last piece, just one nice thing about, I'm skipping ahead here, but blogging now, coming back to Grist and just being a blogger, is that I feel this kind of release, that I can just crank something out and it'll be tomorrow's fish wrap, and I can just try things. And I think that's kind of how you have to do first drafts in general. And hopefully if it's for some place that needs it to be better than fish wrap, then you do a second and third draft. But Or at least that's how I need to do first drafts.
The difference with blogging, of course, is that you're doing your first drafts in public,
Yes.
which has got an upside, actually, I think. People tell me.
And downsides, yes. But
Yeah, we'll talk about the downside in a minute. So here you are, you've got your radio job.
Yeah.
You're doing general assignment stuff, and you're conceiving magazine pieces on the side. So as Dan suggests, you get a good shot out the gate with Harper's.
Mm-hmm.
What keeps you moving in this direction of not just sort of agriculture, food coverage, but this idea of kind of fact-checking like current technical realities? I mean, 'cause that's sort of how I see some of the kind of a through line with your work, you know. We have better medical care, maternity care than ever, and yet more women are dying in childbirth. We have better, you know, environmental controls than ever, yet we still have. I'm trying to understand where that comes from.
Well, I was just interested in it. I mean, it's, I think that certainly on my coast, on the West Coast, you have this feeling that we've gone too far in a number of ways, and that all the glories of civilization and technology have yielded benefits, but have yielded greater negatives.
I can just tell you're from the Berkeley side of the bay and not the Stanford side of the bay.
Right, exactly. So, and this is not a new thing. You can,
No,
I mean, you
sure,
can go back
sure.
throughout history and see this kind of thinking. But you know, there were places where it seemed to me that was actually true, and then there were places where, when I looked at it, you know, it was completely off base. And so it was just sort of fascinating to me to look, you know, here's this kind of foundational idea that I was raised with. And there were all of these stories that could flower out of it. So why would, those are the ones that seemed fascinating to me, and I thought, every editor is going to want these.
So you're really just kind of working out sort of, you know, fact-checking the beliefs you grew up with as a child? I mean,
yeah, but
eating dirt is good for you.
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah.
So this is a big psychodrama we're watching, is that the?
But it wasn't like I was sort of thinking that I was fact-checking. It was just that, oh, this is a fascinating story. You know, I didn't connect it back to like my childhood and my parents. And
Well, I'm
if
not
I had been
trying to
seeing a
impose-
therapist, they probably
I'm not
would
trying
have
to
helped me.
impose that on you as an act of therapy, but it is how you kind of,
Right.
particularly in your book, it's how you frame,
Absolutely.
you know,
No, it's-
as a storytelling thing. So
Yeah.
it's worth asking about. Now, I do want to ask about how the book came to be, because normally, sort of, or in many arcs, you know, you'd get this blogging gig with Grist, and you'd do these stories, and you'd attract attention, and you'd get arguments going, and then somebody would say, hey, why don't you pull this together as a book or whatever. But in fact, it happened the other way around.
Yeah.
So how did this, you're minding your own business, listening to police scanners and
Right.
and freelancing to Harper's on the side. And you're based in Berkeley, right, still? Or where are you?
At that time, I was in San Francisco. Now I live in Berkeley. But
Okay, sorry.
so another professor at the journalism school, Katrina Herron, introduced me to her friend David Kuhn, who is a book agent and was a magazine editor at the New Yorker under Tina Brown, and then started doing this. And he's this very sort of bulldog, aggressive New York type of person. And he said, "Okay, I'm your agent now." You know, before we had gone through anything about what that meant, and I'll help you with some magazine stuff. And when you're ready, you should develop some of these ideas. And he just had me, you know, write him a letter. Say, if you have some idea for a book, just write me a short letter about what this might be. And so I did that, and he said, okay, well, what about this part? This is kind of hazy. Can you fill that out a little more? So I wrote like another couple pages, and he said, okay, well, what would the chapters be of this book? So I listed those. He's like, okay, we'll fill this out a little bit more. And you know, over the course of a couple months, I had an 80-page book proposal from that back and forth.
Which he had just teased out of you
Yeah.
as a series of emails.
Yeah.
Huh.
And which is fortuitous, because I don't think I would have done it just if he just said, write a book proposal when you're ready. And it sold, and so then I had to write this.
And how did you do that? I mean, logistically, you have no doubt a separate office and a this and a great. No, you would you working out of your
I was
your
working
closet?
out of my front room
Uh-huh.
in San Francisco. And when I got some money for the advance, and I convinced my wife to move to Buenos Aires with me for a little while, so we cheaper rents for a little bit. But we came back, and I hadn't finished the book, and I had to keep going. And
So part of your book writing strategy was to move to a country where the cost of living was cheaper.
yeah, but mostly I was just trying to pretend I was Hemingway, and this was like the Paris of modern day. And I had these romantic ideas about being an expat writer.
So you had done all your reporting. How did you juggle the
I had done.
earning the living thing? With
Yeah, I just didn't. I just figured I could live off of my advance, and I could make it work, which was a bad idea. I ran out of money eventually, and it was right. This was right in the middle of the stock market was crashing. It was maybe the end of the world. People were getting ready to go live off dandelions, and and I was like, I'm leaving my job and living off my savings to write a book. So it was good. It kept the stress level high enough to make me get words on paper.
I can only imagine. Yeah. Are you fluent in Spanish?
No, that was the other thing. I thought that I would take Spanish classes too, and write a book, and so when you can't talk to anybody, it makes it easier to write, I guess. My wife is fluent in Spanish, and
okay.
and I picked up enough that I could kind of get by. But I was like, we'd have a dinner party or something, and I would just be like the simpleton of the group, where people are talking, and I'd be like, "It is raining,"
Well, that would focus things, I guess. I would focus things, but it didn't work.
Right. I got some big chunks down, but then there was more that I needed to report, and there was places I needed to go, and it takes a long time to write a book.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
That's what I hear. So, as you're doing this, you're in Buenos Aires, and you run out of money, and you are maybe running out of reporting also.
Mm-hmm.
You move back to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Where's your publisher in all this?
They were supportive in that I'd send a chapter in when I got it done, and they'd say, "Okay, send more. Maybe I'll read it."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think I don't know if this is just my experience, but book publishing is kind of the strategy is kind of like the reproductive strategy of a mollusk. You just release lots and lots of little eggs and spermatozoa, and then most of them die, but maybe one of them will succeed. And so you give complete creative freedom to the people that are, or your little egg, and hope that it blooms, which suited me just fine. And I had a great editor who actually did work with me a lot once I actually had something solid that I was ready to look at.
So you were filing essentially a chapter at a time.
Yeah, just to stay on track. And
So you had structured your book in a kind of episodic way. It is sort of here's the story of childbirth, here's the story of farm microbiology, here's the story. Had you planned to do it that way from the beginning, or did it sort of get dictated by the circumstances of how you decided to go about doing it?
That was basically the plan from the beginning, that I was going to kind of have my, the story of the development of my thinking paralleled by me going out and doing these investigations into microbiome issues or childbirth. So childbirth fits very nicely at the beginning. And,
Well, because you were, of course, expecting.
yes, that too. That seems to happen to a lot of people. There's this coincidence of the book coming and the child coming. And I'd made this deal with myself that I would get the book done before the baby came. And then the baby was overdue and I hadn't finished the book. And I was like, this is like this reverse Penelope thing where if I don't finish the book, the baby will just stay there and we'll have to get a cesarean. And so I wrote like crazy and I finished it just before we got our induction anyway. So, I mean, it was just in my head. But
So, how do you write? I mean, literally, what do you do? I mean, are you an index card person? Do you have like some exotic computer program that you use to organize everything with a special artificial intelligence algorithm, or
no, I mean, well, first I report, which sounds obvious, but it's not obvious to me. Often I'll just, like, I need to get something down on paper and I'll try and write and I'll realize there's not material there. And I think a lot of my technique has actually developed from working in radio where, in radio it's all, you've got to fight for the attention of the listener, right? Because they're driving at the same time and you want them to just be focusing on you and miss their exit. And they will be pulled away and they'll focus on the car in front of them if you don't have a nice piece of tape, which means a nice scene or someone saying something particularly interesting. And so I would go out and do this radio reporting, and after a few years, I'd come back, and by the time I was done, I'd kind of know, I have this piece of tape, and I have this piece of tape, and I can tie them together, and so when I write, it's kind of the same thing. Like I go out and I do a lot of reporting, and then I can just sort of sit and think, and I don't think I need the index cards, although with book length stuff, I do start having to write stuff down. But mostly it's just kind of like, well, I know I want this somewhere, and I know there's this thing, this little scene that happened is good. And here's this little conceit I can make. I can make this analogy that is kind of fun, and that will hold people for 5 more minutes or what have you. And then I'll figure out how to put it together.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. We have a question, but just a quick addition. This business of holding the reader for 5 more minutes is really important. That it really doesn't matter what length you're writing at, but you have to write defensively in a way. You have to assume that your reader could leave you at any moment, and that's a really smart thing that Nate just said. I hope people remember that. Anyway, here's a question, comment.
So do you still, when you're on a writing project, do you still take your radio gear into the field and do transcriptions? How does that transition work for you?
Well, I'll take sometimes I'll use my recorder just as a recorder and do transcriptions. But I don't like mic for good sound quality. A lot of what works for radio is specific to radio. It's almost like writing a song. You have to have your hook and your smart lyric and your chorus and then your bridge, and you have to write around it in this very specific way, and that doesn't make sense for print. So I've tried before to do both at the same time. I'll maybe sell a radio piece here and do a print piece there. And I don't know if people can do that, but I haven't been able to. It's just the things that I need to collect are too different, and the things that I need to be with radio, all you get is the sound, right? So you have to pay a lot of attention to all the technical aspects of gathering the sound. And if you're doing that, you're missing all the visual things that you need to be noting for print. What's this person wearing? How are they carrying themselves? Often what someone will say is less interesting than the way that they say it. And that doesn't, in radio you get a little bit of that because you can hear their voice, but in print you don't unless you are jotting it down. So I'm usually holding a pad and paper, and sometimes I'll put a recorder down as well. But I don't think it's as important.
So the book comes out. It's very well regarded, and it turns out that it's actually an audition piece for Grist, which is, that's an unusual way to go about getting a blogging job. How did they approach you? What was the nature of the assignment?
So Scott Rosenberg, who's the editor there, sent me an email, said that they were looking for a food blogger, and at that point, I was really excited to the idea of like having a job, with a salary, and which is what they
in an English-speaking country.
Right, exactly. So and then there was kind of an audition period where he had me do some. Well, there was an actual audition as well where they had me do some pieces, spend 3 hours reading the news, figuring out something to do, and then write 1 or 2 blog posts.
So even though you were an established freelancer, you'd been a radio guy for 5 years, you had a book under your belt, they still asked you to do an audition?
Yeah.
Did that irritate you?
No. At that point, I was past. My chip had been filed away by poverty and humiliation. No, it didn't bother me at all. I mean, the one thing that I don't think I did a very good job in that audition because I was kind of catering to the parts of blogging that I liked least. I was like, oh, they want me to be a blogger, so maybe that means I need to do like really like fluffy, kind of semi-witty short pieces. And I did that, and they were kind of like, well, we think you're better than this, so we want to give you a second chance. We want to like hire you sort of on contract for a while, but this is kind of not what we were looking for. And what I should have done is just trusted my voice, and that Scott had read this book, and that's what they were interested in. And so that's after I was there for a little bit, I was able to relax back into that, I think.
Nate, did Scott tell you at all why he was interested in that kind of a skeptical take that would be actually pretty challenging to the Grist audience? Was that a deliberate thing, or
I think so. I have to be a little. I've always, when people ask me this, I generally refer them to Scott because I got into trouble initially when I first started the GMO series, which was very quickly out of the gate when I got hired at Grist, because I said something like, well, I feel like, on Twitter, which is always where you get into trouble. And I said something like, I feel like Grist just hasn't engaged with these issues in a really scientific way. And and I had no business saying that because I hadn't read all of Grist's coverage on GMOs before this, and had no idea really what I was talking about. But with that disclaimer, I do think that he was looking for someone who could cover food from a rigorous perspective. I mean, I think that thing that I was talking about with the analogy of coverage of food and agriculture being like covering medicine, but only talking to the alternative medicine people. I think that there was some of that he recognized, and at the same time, he didn't want just someone who's going to be like a strictly science writer covering food. He wanted someone who had the same, what's the word, the same kind of feelings about the food movement that many of their readers did. So I think that's sort of what made me a fit, that I was going to be scientifically rigorous, but I also was of the tribe in a way.
Well, so give us a sense, if you will. Not everyone here is a reader of Grist. It's a special publication. How would you describe it?
So it's a green news site.
Green, yeah.
Although it's always in flux. You know, what does that actually mean? And I think that the main thing that we're trying to do is to talk to people who are young and weren't around for the first Earth Day, and have had all of these messages of doom and gloom cast upon them, and are interested in the environment, but also realize that that simply repeating that we're all doomed is not a way to fix things. So it's sort of trying to approach. I mean, the tagline is doom and gloom with a sense of humor. So
yeah, it's a beacon in the smog.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's trying to approach these things and take them seriously, but also think seriously about solutions and take them not too seriously at times.
And it's funding. It's kind of foundation supported by a broad range of philanthropic organizations, many of which, or some percentage of which, are issue driven.
Right.
And it's fair to say, and that because this is part of what makes what I think you then did with the series interesting, that the readers of Grist fundamentally kind of despise corporate agribiz, are, as a generalization, very anti-GMO. One essayist I looked at who was talking about how what an interesting and unusual move, maybe, to have someone like you assigned suddenly to do a long and exhaustive and reasonably even-handed takeout on GMOs. He said it was like watching the very conservative publication National Review suddenly do an even-handed take on climate change. This was just not something that you would have expected. So when you were given this assignment, you just come on board, we've decided you're not completely lame as a blogger, so we want to give you something big to chew on. Hey, I have a good idea. Let's take the most sort of polarized agribiz, food, environmental debate of the last 30 years and see what you can do with it.
Right. That was essentially it. So Scott Rosenberg, who brought me on, it was like, this is something I've really been interested in. I think that we should dig into it. And I was kind of looking for direction and said, great. And the idea of just blogging it was initially really terrifying to me, because this is not what we do generally as journalists. We go out and we talk to everybody and we assemble all the facts, and then we kind of get it right and we fact check it and we edit it, and then we put it out in the world. And he was saying, why don't you just kind of blog as you go, and you'll figure out something, and then you put that out there, and then you can read the comments and you can make corrections, and we can just, rather than hoarding a bunch of stuff, just put it out there and see what happens. Which felt a little bit uncomfortable, but I said, okay, we'll try this, and I think was really the brilliant suggestion that made the series interesting and popular.
In what way?
Well, with these issues, people tend to know what they think and tune in to the journalism that reinforces that, or not tune in at all. And by putting it out there as I was going and trying to figure it out myself and being vulnerable in that way, it created a different reason to tune in rather than just, oh, here's a piece of evidence that I can use, to sling at my enemies. So people were reading it that weren't completely partisan and who wanted to see what happened, in this drama of me trying to figure it out and kind of wanted to, see me get batted around by one partisan and the other. And
in the struggle for the soul of Nathanael Johnson, this week he meets with Satan in the form of Monsanto. Or,
yes.
Is that?
Yeah.
Right. You made your search the narrative of the series, which is interesting. But I also think as I was reading those stories, I didn't really get this. I got the sense that you were open-minded, but I really didn't get the sense from the very beginning that you had changed your mind. That you had a pretty clear idea of what you thought at the beginning, and by the end, it wasn't significantly different than what you had thought at the beginning.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that in the beginning, I sort of tacked a little bit pro-GMO, with the first post was about, I took on health, and I was like, let me just figure out, I kind of feel like I've heard from a lot of scientifically minded people that the health issues, at least with the GMOs that we have out already, aren't as terrifying as we've been led to believe. And I talked to Margaret Mellon from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she basically confirmed, that was her thinking. And I was like, well, if she thinks that, then And so initially my strategy was, well, I'll sort of tack this way. And then with these issues, there's always, when you look bigger, when you look at the holistic picture, there's always more that the kind of very scientifically minded, rigorous, reductive thinkers are missing. And so I was kind of expecting to find what you hear a lot of the anti-GMO people talking about these days, that the health issues are not such a big deal, but they're, when you look at the associated issues with the increase in herbicide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you start to get real problems that we need to be dealing with and changing immediately. And I think my surprise was that as I went farther and farther out in those concentric circles, there was just a lot less, I thought, to be worried about than I had expected. So yeah, maybe, that's interesting to, every once in a while I think, because I was blogging, it's on the fly, these things are kind of sloppy, and it would be interesting to go back and revisit and see if I could make something more cohesive and solid out of this. And so it would be interesting to rethink the strategy now that I know what I know about the evidence.
See, I guess part of what I'm still trying to understand here, and it goes a little bit to Dan's question, which is to what degree this was actually a narrative strategy.
Well, it wasn't.
And to what degree you just simply had been thrown in the deep end of the pool by your editor.
It wasn't. I think it was a narrative strategy by my editor, but it wasn't. I wasn't conscious of this at all.
Yeah. So you were babe in toyland.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And how was that?
It was really tough. There were many nights where there was 1 or 2 hours of sleep, and I'd wake up and kind of be thinking about something that someone had said and something I needed to check and read up on, and I'd get up and write out my thoughts, and then there would be an email from someone like castigating me, So I was getting all of these, it was kind of my first experience living on the internet, where people's general social niceties tend to diminish, and so I hadn't had this experience of, people sending me emails which were like just dripping with condescension, like berating me, for like 2 paragraphs, and then they'd be like, and by the way, I think you should really talk to me as a source. We have a lot. Which is, I think, actually a strategy. It's like the neg, it's like, you got this wrong and you need to pay attention to me. And of course journalists do, because they want to get the correction right. And so I pay a lot more than someone just pitching me some crazy thing. Mm-hmm. And then.
So this is a 26-part series. And the posts are all long. I think there's a tendency often when we say, oh, blog posts, that must be like 150 to 500 words or whatever. These are all long, substantive pieces.
Right.
These 26 blog posts, which I will say are each, appended to them are long and substantive comments
right.
By your readers, which you are digesting on the fly, or just simply?
Initially I was reading everything, within the first few days at least.
Was that a mistake, or was that a benefit?
In the very beginning, I think it was useful. There were actually, the first few comments to come in were substantive, and people knew more than me. As I started to learn enough that I knew more than the average commenter, it became less and less useful and more predictable.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you had some sleepless nights, and you were beginning to talk a little bit about your experience in getting feedback from internet commenters. Did you ever reach a point in not just this blog series, but when you were writing your book or when you were working on other stories, where you doubted yourself as a reporter, and how did you deal with these doubts, and how did it make you a better reporter? I'm hoping it did. I'm assuming it did. I think it did.
It was all self-doubt and loathing. It's not like one discrete point.
Do you still feel like you could be better?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, otherwise I wouldn't have a reason to keep doing it. I think that I was really worried about, when I get an email like the one I described, and these were coming often from people who were like activists, they're sources in the industry or in civil society. What I was really worried about is that I would get polarized, that I'd react with emotion, and I wouldn't be able to sort things out. And so I think that was the major source of self-doubt, that I would be unable to see useful evidence, or I'd frame things in the wrong way. And I tried, I was constantly talking about that with my editor. Let me know if you please push me back if you feel like I'm going too far one way or the other. Push back if the evidence seems wrong, and obviously trying to do that within myself as well, but also trying to set up those kind of exterior safeguards. But it's hard. I think one useful thing that I learned from this is that you can tell people to back off, and they do. There are a couple times where I said, this doesn't make me feel good. I feel like this is unprofessional. What are you doing? Would you treat me like that? Just a really blunt email, and people would say, oh, I read this, went back and read this, and actually, yeah. And often it would work better if I'd say, let's just communicate over the phone, because people put their social filter on when they're talking on the phone. Completely different. It's amazing.
So I wonder, when you went into this, it's clear I think, that in a way, I don't want to say set up, but self-selected, mean, as a reporter, you have kind of positioned yourself as a character.
Right.
You know, I'm Nate, I grew up green, but I have respect for facts.
Right.
And so therefore, I'm a great surrogate for the reasonable reader trying to navigate a troubling but controversial, polarized subject. So when you went into that, I mean, were you conscious of yourself that way? I mean, you have written yourself through your book
Yeah, exactly.
as that character. And if you did, I'm wondering, did you think you were going to like change minds, that somehow this would be transformational for people, or did you just think it would just be transformational for you? Like your arc as a character would be at the end, you'd end up with opinion A or opinion B,
Right.
or actually in this case, opinion C.
Right.
But
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, when I write things, I never have grand expectations of changing the world. You know, my goal is generally to kind of to entertain people, and I find that's just much more achievable than the changing the world goal. And I thought that, yeah, I thought I might change people's minds coming along with me, but you know, I didn't. Like I was saying earlier, I sort of expected that I'd start with this health stuff, which I could say like, oh, there's, you know, I used some kind of strong language in the beginning, and I forget exactly what it was, but you know, there really are no health issues with GMOs. Pretty much everybody on all sides agrees that the evidence is pretty much zilch. And then I expected to be able to gain people on that side and then be able to tack back. And when I looked at the big picture of the environmental issues and stuff, then those people would come along with me. So I thought maybe there was strategy at least, but I don't know. I never make expectations about actually changing things.
well, I ask this because I think this experience that we're talking about here relates to a lot of things that science journalists are called upon to cover now or find themselves in the middle of, whether it's something as a long-running and seemingly intractable controversy like genetically modified organisms, you know, up or down.
Right. Well,
Vaccines, you know, which we're embroiled in at the moment. Gee, public health, is that a good idea or what?
Right.
I don't know. And clearly there are people who really are irreconcilably disagreeing about this. Climate change I was making fun of earlier, but that's another one where, you know, this whole idea of fact-based evidence, which is of course what we traffic in. And at the beginning, I mean, you talked about this wonderful epiphany of journalism, what a great thing. You can talk to people and arrive at facts, and then facts are transformational. Right. In these kinds of controversies, they are not transformational,
right.
Apparently.
Right.
So do you think that there are topics where, as a journalist, you can't move the conversation forward by just offering reliable information? I mean, what?
Yes, I think that's right. You can't just move the conversation forward simply by offering reliable information. But I think you can move the conversation forward by offering reliable information disguised as entertainment.
What's interesting about what you did, Nate, is that, you know, this cultural cognition theory is all the rage now. And one of the tenets of cultural cognition theory is that messages delivered within the tribe, to the tribe, are more effective, right? And so theoretically, if people identify you as a fellow tribesman, theoretically you could actually move them on this issue in a way that somebody else who is a plant geneticist
Right.
and a real hardcore science person did not. Do you have any evidence at all that the fact that you did it in this context made any kind of difference, as cultural cognition theory would suggest that maybe it would?
I mean, sparse evidence of people tweeting and emailing me and telling me that they thought this was really interesting and they're glad to get informed on it, and telling me that they changed their minds. But you know, I think that those pieces of evidence are outnumbered probably 10 to 1 by the number of people telling me that I'm no longer part of the tribe, or you know, or must be some spy sent in by a seed industry. So, I mean, I think obviously you always hear more from the people who are angry than the people who want to hand you plaudits. So that 10 to 1 might be evened out somewhat. But I think it's always a hard road to hoe. You know, and I wasn't like an established figure. You know, if I had been like Tom Philpott, who had been at Grist before me and been blogging for years and years and years and had this foundation of trust, I think maybe things would have been a little bit different in that regard. So, you know, or Michael Pollan, yeah.
One of the interesting, yeah, please. Sorry, I didn't see the mic, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about where your skepticism comes from. I mean, do you trace it back to like your experience in Burley, Idaho, or were you was that really instilled in you by your parents, or the fact that you grew up in such a specifically ideological like setting, or?
I don't know if I can give a
Just innately
totally
skeptical?
accurate answer to this. I mean, my parents were always interested in science, and some of my earliest and fondest memories are, you know, my dad taking me to these various museums and stuff. And so that sense of wonder and the idea that there were things out there to be discovered was with me from a very early age. You know, for all of my parents' crazy ideas, and I could certainly list many of them, they were skeptical people in many ways. My dad subscribed to the Skeptical Inquirer for a while, and you know, he was really worried because we were kind of an agnostic family when it came to religion, that we were going to be swept into a cult because people didn't have some kind of foundation, like understand what the deal was with, you know, and how far what the uses of religion were. Then they would hunger for it, and they would go off and join David Koresh or whoever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there were elements of that all the way back, but I think it's true that there was like this real turning point when I was like doing journalism, and my job was to like find out what was real for the first time, and I was in this atmosphere where the mainstream beliefs all around me were 180 degrees different from the things that I had assumed to be true, and I had to be a reporter in that. You know, I came to Burley, Idaho, and I had hair down to here and looked nothing like anybody else, but I was expected to kind of uphold this idea of integrity, and it forced me to reflect on my own liberal ideals, and so I think that's a big part of it.
The beauty of reporting, the beauty of the act of reporting is that it forces you to confront ideas that are uncomfortable to you, you know, and you know, that's the scary thing about so much journalism now that's unreported, is that the reporter's not forced to confront anything. Right. And you know, that's just so spectacularly important to somehow try to retain this idea of engaging with ideas that are foreign to you. And the reporting process forces you to do that. It's so important.
Okay, so I used to have a colleague at the American Museum of Natural History who sincerely believed in the Yeti, which is ironic because he got his PhD in evolutionary biology. But if you pushed him, he would kind of acknowledge that it was problematic, but he said that North America needed an indigenous ape, and we didn't have one, so the Yeti filled that void. And it was entertaining. But his belief doesn't really have a large, I could work really hard to prove that he was wrong, but in terms of effect, it doesn't really have a really large effect on my life and my well-being. And comparing, say, the GMO debate versus what's going on right now with the vaccination debate, one clearly has tangible long-term effects on public health and public well-being, and the GMO debate, one way or the other, seems to mostly affect agribusiness, since many of the broader claims over GMO, in terms of yields and everything else, it depends on what you're growing, and it's, like hunger and everything, it's way more complicated than growing more crops. So I guess my question is, it's like, that doesn't seem to really, we seem very fixated on who's right, as opposed to, does it matter? Is it okay to have beliefs that are maybe not substantiated by science, but don't actually impact social well-being that much, as it stands right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we should say that if, the people that really worry at a gut level about GMOs do see a tremendous potential impact on public health, and I think that the foundational worry for a lot of Greens is that there's going to be something that gets out into the world that's really novel and is reproducing and causes the end of the living planet that we love, and creates something very different. And you can have a long discussion about whether those fears are reasonable. But I think that your point is really well taken. This, if something isn't directly affecting you, and what's the rationale for you to go out and spend hours and hours researching it and figuring out what the truth is behind it? And with GMOs, people have some hazy idea of what the dangers might be, and whether those dangers are real or not, they don't really see any benefit themselves. So what's the incentive for them to go out and do those hours and hours of research? And so I understand this this opposition, and it seems like not just an understandable position, but actually a rational position. That as a rational person, I don't see any benefit for being pro-GMO, and I'm not going to spend there's much better ways for me to spend my time, so I'll be anti-GMO. Makes a lot of sense.
And so as our character who made this long and torturous journey, where did you end up?
Well, about
part 26.
Yeah, that's a good segue. I mean, my kind of conclusion was I've spent 6 months on this, and my conclusion is that none of it matters.
Oh, that's a big help.
Yeah. People on both sides really did not like this. The anti-GMO people, obviously for the same reasons I just mentioned, didn't like this, and then these pro-GMO people who had been following this, who have dedicated their lives to crop science and feel like they're doing this great humanitarian work. I write this and they're like, you're saying my life's work does not matter. But it seems to me, as we just were talking in this question and answer, that it's become this battlefield for a proxy war. That the actual issue,
a proxy war.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That the actual issue itself isn't that vital when, on the scale of grand human ambitions and the fate of the earth. But we channel into it all of these other ideas, and it's really mostly about the industrialization of agriculture and the anxiety that we feel around our alienation from food, and all of these things are important things to talk about and to fix. So this is my conclusion, was trying to fix them through this proxy war is really counterproductive. We end up focusing our energy and our resources on GMOs than the actual issues that make industrial agriculture problematic.
Do you buy this argument, Nate, that it matters because it's a kind of a nose under the tent thing, that if we allow unscientific thinking to triumph on GMOs, then next it'll be vaccines? I think there's a lot of evidence that that's not true, that each of these issues have their own weird demographics that don't necessarily track.
Right.
But I do think that a lot of people who are really upset about the lack of public acceptance of GMOs are not really focused on GMOs themselves. They're fixated on this idea of, quote,
Science.
irrationality.
Yeah.
Unquote.
Yeah, it becomes issues of authority and trust and empiricism, and
Right, and I think there are a lot of people out there who would like us to live in a society where empiricism drives public policy, and I would like to live in that society. But the problem is, if it's a nose under the tent, we've got to watch out for the 10 other whole bodies who have gotten in under the tent. We haven't been a strictly rational society ever, and I think we're actually more scientifically rational in our public policy making than we have been in the past. And my response to that is, do you want to be right, or do you want to win? Do you want to be right, or do you want to change things for the better? And I think that those two goals conflict. That sometimes being right and punishing the people who have been irrational in some way will lead to worse public policy. And I think that's certainly the case with GMOs.
now as you go forward now, you'll continue to cover this in one way or another. Although I understand your portfolio at Grist as a food writer is quite broad, and this is not the only thing.
Right.
But you have now been tarred.
It's a tar baby.
With the 26-part series on GMOs. And again, because this is, I think, applicable to other science journalists in other untractable controversies, are you now contaminated? I mean, do you have a sense that readers now see you coming and they go, oh, here comes that Johnson guy. Oh, he's the ...
Certainly, in certain quarters, certainly.
Well, what do you mean? I mean,
well, I think that there are people who, if you go to GM Watch, read what they've written about me, they've kind of defined me as a pro-GMO partisan, and so I think people that live in that tribe will see me coming and announce that that's my framework. I don't know, to be perfectly honest. My sense is that I'm not that well known in general. Like, I'm just another science writer for the most part, and that there is some sort of counterweight, that there are also people out there who see me as kind of, what's the right word? Too sympathetic to organic food and
are you
those
seeing
types
this
of
that have it both ways?
Yeah, so I'm like despised on the fringes of both sides.
I congratulate you, sir.
If it's not too personal a question, maybe it is. What about your mentor? What about Michael? He's been pretty circumspect in his comments about GMOs, but what he has said has been highly skeptical.
Right.
If it's not too private to discuss, what has been the reaction from that quarter?
Michael's been incredibly supportive. I mean, I think that like all of us, Michael Pollan is a human with foibles, and he's a very what he puts out in Twitter form or in short emails represent a very different part of his amygdala perhaps than the person that he is when he's discussing issues with you in person. And so I've always found him to be a guy that relishes debate and relishes new ideas, and so he's read at least, I don't know if he's read the entire 26-part slog, but he's read the conclusion, and he's offered his feedback, and yeah, for the most part, it's been very positive. We haven't had like the sit down, like hash it out, like what about this point, heart to heart type of talk. And I'd be open to that if he wanted to spend the time doing that, but I think he's sort of moved on to other things.
Well, if I can stay with this for a second, one of the interesting things I thought that you did in the course of this very long and thoughtful and exhaustive 26-part series is that at one point you sort of stopped, and it was a very kind of social media meta mirror moment.
Right.
You stopped the whole series and you had a very long discussion with Michael Pollan and with Amy Harmon of the New York Times, who has been in this forum before, over a Twitter comment that Michael Pollan had made suggesting, and I don't remember the exact language, and maybe you do, but it was something. Thank you, that was the phrase I was trying to find, yes. That, the very good Amy Harmon, wonderful long piece about the pros and cons of genetically engineering better oranges, I guess in Hawaii, was it?
Florida.
Florida, sorry. And his comment was, there were an awful lot of industry talking points. And it seemed striking for a couple of reasons. One, it was a very interesting use of the blog and the whole way this thing was unfolding, that you could, in fact, as a reporter and as a narrator, sort of stop and pull over to the curb and get out of the car and talk to somebody sitting on the park bench for a while, who was part of the debate, but also it offered a real contrast to an entirely different way of reporting this kind of controversy. Amy Harmon's piece in particular was a wonderfully classic narrative, long, traditional look at this issue, and it did all the things that you do when you're doing a long narrative. I mean, you weight arguments by picking attractive characters and things like that, and it's all above board, but I was wondering, you did have a long conversation with Michael Pollan and Amy Harmon about how you report such matters. I mean, that's really what that conversation became in the middle of this series. So I was wondering two things. One, why did you do that? And then two, what did you come away with from this pro-con conversation about this topic by two people who were really at the top of their game nationally, as Michael is a food writer, whatever you want to call, however you want to pigeonhole him, and Amy as a kind of classic investigative, long-form narrative science journalist. It's a real kind of clash of cultures. I was wondering
I'm not sure
why did you do that? The question is, why did you do that? It was just a Twitter message, for God's sake. You must have spent like 10,000 words on it.
Yeah, well, because it was such a big deal, and I could, I don't know if it fit in the series, but I was working on this, and it happened, and it kind of made sense for me to to stop. And nobody, the Columbia Journalism Review had kind of done a short thing, which I kind of found unsatisfying. So I wanted to know more, and that's what drove it. It would have been nice to. It was kind of an awkward form, because you just had this one long column, and we had to figure out who to put on top, and so Michael, more people know about Michael, so he went on top, and then you had to scroll all the way down to get to Amy, and so there were many things that were not ideal about it, but it was just sort of, this is interesting to me that there was this reaction, and it went on for days and days and days where people were talking about this this tweet. So that's why I did it, and then this is the second question about what did I take away from it in terms of how you do long form?
Well, it was a very meta moment, if I may say, as a media theory guru, I guess. I don't know what your degree is in.
Yeah,
media
I have
theory,
an undergrad degree.
Undergraduate degree in media theory. It was a media theory moment.
Right.
So I'm not sure what it taught you in this process that you are dragging us along in, as loyal readers in your.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little bit out of the moment, but I do remember it feeling clarifying to me. There's that experience you have when you interview, you interview people about a fact that's in contest, and at least I have this experience where the last person I interview, I'm totally convinced by, almost always, and then I go and interview the other guy, and I'm like, oh, you're right, and then if you go back and forth enough, then eventually you start to feel like, oh, maybe this other guy is not so right. In this piece, it felt like I could understand where they were both coming from, I felt like that, oh, you're right, Michael, you're right, oh, Amy, you're right, you're completely right about this, and I think that they were, I mean, the issues that they brought up, it's like they were just missing each other, they both had legitimate arguments, I thought, but they weren't the same arguments. It wasn't like there was one that needed to win out over the other because they weren't head to head. That's very abstract, but you asked me for media theory. I'm going to quote
And I
Alpha's
got
error
what I
for you.
deserved.
Yeah.
It's true. So maybe to conclude, unless there's another question out here, I wonder, okay, you've gone through this, and I wonder what advice you would have for someone who was about to, or had just been asked by their editor to take on some polarized topic and ski through it. I mean,
Yeah.
What would you tell me or her?
Well, I think the first thing to know, I've talked a lot about the dangers of doing something like this, but there's also tremendous benefits. I think that this, more than anything else that I've done, more than the book, more than pieces that I'm much more proud of in terms of the writing and the storytelling, got recognized and got seen by lots of people. And Jack Schaefer has a great line that wherever you are, just find where there's someone hammering on an anvil and you stick your thumb in between it, the hammer and the anvil, and that's your job as a journalist. And so if you can stand it, it certainly is effective. If you write about something that people are passionate about, they're going to read about it, and they're going to read it, and they're going to spread it around. I guess I mentioned this piece of advice about being willing to tell people to back off, and I was very timid about doing that. I'd just sort of be like, all right, I'm going to let all of this, name calling and abuse wash over me, and I'll just respond with like, well, there is one part of this that I having trouble understanding, can you help me find this fact or that fact, or is there some evidence you can show me that will help me back this up? So I would just sort of like, it was like, bring it on, you know, you hit me and now I love you, I'll make you make you an omelet. And so I think that it's worthwhile to tell people if they cross the line, because people do all the time, especially on email, or outside of normal human communication. What are the other things that, I mean, I think that just, you know, to be prepared for it to be hard, you know, if it's going to hurt. And, you know, I'm sort of thinking about now, like, is there a way that I can repeat this? And do I want to, you know? Is there some other subject, or, and can I do it in a way that's useful and interesting and not simply attention grabbing and mercenary? But yeah, I'm not sure I want to. I certainly have like done things that are much more academic and less polarized for my subsequent big projects. But yeah, the next thing that I'm thinking about doing is looking closely at meat, and there is always some of that, at least with like animal rights people versus farmers and carnivores. So it'll be interesting to see if that draws the same kind of animosity. But I'm sort of talking in circles while I'm trying to think about pieces of advice and not coming up with a whole lot. Other than to say that I think that it's, I feel like I was rewarded for being willing to put stuff out there that felt unfinished and sloppy, and being willing to make mistakes and make corrections, and you know, that still feels foreign to me, but I think that that's a legitimate form of journalism, and people shouldn't be afraid to do that, as long as they're announcing that that's what they're doing at the outset. I don't feel like that's, you know, people are saying, oh, you're this kind of hack because you have done this stuff that's because you had to make a bunch of corrections. And
I think another really important thing that you did is that you didn't pander. You didn't pander to them ideologically, and you didn't pander in terms of oversimplifying. You told them, you walked them through what you knew, and what you knew was highly nuanced. But because you did it with a kind of a narrative, careful, engaging narrative voice, it held them, despite the fact that it was counterintuitive for them, and despite the fact that it was nuanced. So to me, that's a really important lesson, especially on the web, where space is not at such a premium, that it really is okay not to just focus solely on simplifying and pandering, that other kinds of journalism can succeed and do succeed.
You've come a very long way to be with us this evening, and I can tell you that from this seat, it was entirely worth the journey. And I thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
for coming.
Appreciate it.